Hi, my name's Sean McNeilis. I'm an adjunct researcher at the Centre for Urban Transitions at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne, Australia. This talk was a presentation at the Asia Pacific Network for Housing Research Conference in July 2022. I want to begin with two acknowledgements. First, I want to acknowledge the history, culture, and spirituality of the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And secondly, I want to acknowledge the work of the members of the conference organising team. In this presentation, I will work through some issues under four headings: background, values as social, dimensions of housing, the role of a heuristic of housing, and then conclude with some comments. My research interest is in how we think about housing, what we as researchers bring to our research, and the presuppositions, what we take for granted in our research and our methods. In every research project, whether qualitative or quantitative research, there is implicitly or explicitly a heuristic that guides our research. As explicit, this heuristic may be a definition of our research topic or an analytical framework. It may vary according to our interest or our discipline. It may focus on a particular aspect of housing. It may or may not be part of a larger framework. Many heuristics are taken for granted, but the more explicit our heuristic, the better we can appreciate its strengths and weaknesses, the more we can develop these heuristics and do better research. One of the key issues facing housing research is the development of a transdisciplinary heuristic of housing. So this presentation introduces a novel understanding of values and a comprehensive transdisciplinary heuristic structure for housing using a values-based approach. Values have had an ambivalent and turbulent history within the social sciences. Notwithstanding, in recent years there has been a resurgence of interest even within housing research. Predominantly, debates about values have focused on the personal values of individuals, personal and group values as explanations for social phenomena, and whether the values of researchers impact on their results. We have come to think of values as the way in which we justify our actions, and as subjective, inherited, ideological, and irrational. Now, I want to take a different approach. In doing so, I locate values within the broader context of the capacity for performance of individuals or social agents and our sociality. John Turner, amongst others, has pointed to the distinction between housing as a noun and housing as a verb. As a noun, it refers to the object that is made. As an object, it meets not just our need for shelter, but also many other desires, needs, and wants for health and well-being, privacy, security, inclusion and participation in society, sustainability, autonomy, and identity. As a verb, housing refers to the act of making housing. This includes a broad range of activities: designing, planning, financing, building, etc., each requiring people with different skills and undertaking different tasks within different types of organisations and institutions. In short, we could describe this as the social ecosystem of housing. But I would want to introduce a third understanding of housing that is neither a noun nor a verb, so distinct from the object and from activities whereby housing is made. Before housing becomes an object, before certain activities are undertaken to produce housing, we make a decision to produce housing. We deliberate about what we want, we choose to produce housing. This is housing as what is intended. It is housing as value. It is a stance, a direction before we set in train the activities that produce it and what is actually achieved. In some senses, it is housing as policy. It is what we choose to do. It is our motivation. So here we have a three-level structure of housing: what is actually achieved, a social ecosystem, and values. But what is actually achieved is the result of past decisions and actions. These are seldom taken in isolation. They are almost always contributions to larger ventures in cooperation with others. Values are not just personal, they are social. The planning, design, construction, exchange, and consumption of housing involve cooperative schemes of recurrence. So rather than focusing on personal values, the approach here is to ask what values are embedded in housing and constitute the current housing system. Housing is not one-dimensional. As I've already noted, through housing we satisfy a range of desires, needs and wants, and give preference to some over others. I would suggest that housing has 6 dimensions: vital, technological, economic, political, cultural and religious. Each of these dimensions has a technical and specific meaning. The key questions here are: how are the dimensions related in such a way that each is distinct and separate from the others? And how are they related such that an integration of all the dimensions would provide an understanding of housing as a whole? These dimensions are related to one another as a particular type of hierarchy. Each dimension is constituted by its own system of terms and relations, which explains certain things about housing. It does not, however, explain everything. So we need a higher viewpoint, a higher dimension, which on the one hand recognises what is already explained by the lower dimension, but on the other hand explains other aspects of housing. They are related in that the lower dimension provides the conditions for the occurrence of the higher dimension, but the higher dimension selects and organises the characteristics of the lower dimension in such a way that the higher dimension is achieved. Together, they provide an understanding of housing as a whole. Now let me go through each of these dimensions. The vital dimension explains how housing meets our biological needs, such as shelter, safety from diseases, poisons and hazards, and access to food, water, energy, clean air, light, and the natural environment. The technological dimension explains the know-how in housing, such as the know-how used in transforming materials into products for constructing dwellings, as well as the know-how used to train and organise people and to exchange and manage dwellings. The economic dimension explains the circuits of production through which housing becomes a component of a standard of living. The political or governance dimension explains how we reach effective agreement on working through cooperatively to produce housing as a component of a standard of living, such as agreement on what will be produced, how prices will be set, how land will be divided up and used for particular purposes, how dwellings will be bought and sold. The cultural dimension explains the meanings that inform the life of a society and its institutions, such as the significance of home, who lives together, and the significance of the design and siting of dwellings. The religious dimension explains a community's stance on their place in the history of the universe and the ultimate destiny of humanity. Now, each of these dimensions originates from a particular type of value, is implemented through the social ecosystem, and produces a particular outcome, housing with particular characteristics. I now want to place this heuristic of housing within the larger context of a housing research framework that I refer to as functional collaboration. In the process of going from where we are now to implementing something new, we can identify within ourselves 8 types of questions about housing: empirical questions, heuristic or definitional questions, historical questions, critical evaluative questions, transformative visionary questions, policy questions, strategic questions, practical questions. The first 4 of these types of questions are to do with our understanding of the past, and the second 4 are about looking forward to the future. But to answer each type of question, we need a specialised method, and this gives rise to 8 functional specialties: research, interpretation, history, dialectic, foundations, policies, systematics, communications. Rather than dealing with the complexity of housing by dividing it up between specialist disciplines, functional collaboration retains a comprehensive heuristic throughout the research process. So a heuristic that goes through history, dialectic, foundations, policies, systematics, and communications. And it deals with complexity by dividing housing research between functional specialties. Thereby, it links research and policy, theory and practice. And moreover, it aligns the process of research with making progress in housing. In developing a comprehensive heuristic of housing, I have been operating in the second functional specialty, interpretation. What I am outlining is not a grand theory of housing that would explain how all housing systems operated. Rather, it is a heuristic structure that captures the significant, relevant, and essential elements that constitute a housing system, that provides a guide to what is and what is not a housing system, and provides a way of understanding the multiplicity of variables that constitute the variety of housing systems, whether in Asia, the Pacific, Europe, Africa, or the Americas. This comprehensive heuristic of housing provides a guide, a framework for asking further questions about any housing system, a framework for asking and answering historical, critical questions, visionary, policy, strategic, and practical questions, all about housing. In conclusion, it seems to me that a values-based approach to housing research provides a comprehensive heuristic of housing. It locates a range of different approaches to housing research in a larger context. It provides guidance on the questions we need to ask about an operative housing system and its historical development. What are the particular vital values, technological values, economic values, political values, cultural values, and religious values incorporated into the particular housing system under investigation, and how have these changed over time? It provides a framework for comparing different local, regional, and national housing systems. It provides a framework for implementing change in housing systems and for making better housing systems. Finally, to return to the theme of the Asia Pacific Network for Housing Research Conference of 2022, Housing in the City, Livability, Equity and Wellbeing. Livability, equity and well-being are values in which housing has a role. But this role is not straightforward, as these values are achieved not only through housing. So I leave you with a couple of key questions. First, what are each of these values? What are the relevant, significant and essential elements and their relations that would constitute them? Second, what are the characteristics of housing that contribute to them, and what are the cooperative schemes of recurrence that achieve these characteristics? Thank you for listening. An expanded version of this presentation is available on my website, artfulhousing.com.au. Thank you once again for listening.